Those in favour? Those against? As have it. Prime Minister.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the meeting of the House, at the next meeting of the House, I will move the following motion. Whereas the Government of Jamaica determined that it was necessary to conduct a comprehensive evaluation on the effectiveness of Jamaica's membership in the Caribbean Community CARICOM and the ACP CARIFORUM framework, and whereas it is timely for Jamaica to determine the impact of these regional arrangements on Jamaica's economic growth and development, with particular reference to trade in goods and services, investment promotion, international competitiveness, employment, and security. And whereas the Government of Jamaica established a commission in July 2016 with the mandate to conduct an in-depth examination of those aspects of Jamaica's existing regional relationships that may not be fully meeting their intended objectives, and whereas this required an assessment of CARICOM's performance against the goals and objectives enunciated in the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, and an identification of the challenges in advancing the regional integration process, and whereas the commission established by the Government of Jamaica was chaired by Mr. Bruce Golding, former Prime Minister, who was assisted by 18 distinguished commission members. And whereas the final commission report containing its findings and recommendations was delivered to the Prime Minister of Jamaica, the Most Honourable Andrew Holness, on December the 31st, 2017, and whereas the final commission report was tabled in the House of Representatives on February the 6th, 2018, to allow for its consideration and debate to seek consensus on Jamaica's future engagement in the region. And whereas Jamaica will assume the chair of CARICOM in July 2018, now, therefore, be it resolved by the House of Representatives as follows. 1. The movement towards greater regional integration and cooperation within CARICOM remains relevant, important, and strategic to Jamaica. 2. It is essential for CARICOM to focus primarily on the gains that can be achieved through the single market, in view of the fact that issues related to sovereignty and supranationality continue to play a part in impeding progress towards a single economy. 3. All member states must make a clear and definitive commitment to establish the CARICOM single market with a specific, time-bound, measurable, and verifiable program of action to fulfill obligations. A period of 5 years should be proposed to meet objectives under a program of action for full implementation of the single market, taking into account the CARICOM Secretariat's implementation plan, as well as the capacity of individual member states to meet the requirements. The governance dilemma, 5, within CARICOM and CARICOM institutions must be effectively addressed and a performance-based, results-based approach adopted. The rules-based system, 6, that holds CARICOM and its member states accountable to the peoples of the region must be strengthened to ensure compliance and facilitate dispute settlement in accordance with the Treaty of Chaguaramas. Greater prominence should be assigned to the role of the private sector, 7, in supporting the CSM objectives as well as in monitoring member states' compliance and implementation of the CSM. 8, Jamaica shall require a review of the basis for assessment of the member states' financial contribution to CARICOM and regional institutions, as well as a rationalization of existing bodies. 9, CARICOM should seek to broaden its economic cooperation with neighboring states including those which comprise CARIFORUM, and seek, where possible, to take advantage of the CARIFORUM construct to negotiate future trade agreements with third parties. And 10, Jamaica will further evaluate its terms of engagements with CARICOM if stated and agreed commitments towards advancing the CSM are not implemented by all member states within the agreed time frame. Mr. Speaker, I beg to give further notice that at a later stage today, I will move for the suspension of standing orders to enable me to take this motion.
Public business.
Mr. Speaker, today is a historic day because this resolution that has just been read by the Prime Minister and the debate that will follow is going to have a severe impact on the way forward. It's the introduction to the debate.
Well, you're asking the Speaker to declare that we are at public business.
Yes. So, Mr. Speaker, it is a very important day for us, and I therefore invite you to allow us to go directly to public business to enable the Prime Minister to open the debate.
Mr. Speaker, for such an important resolution, sir, I think that we should at least, all of us should at least have a copy so that we can digest the information.
Yeah, it can be circulated.
He has a copy. Sit down.
Prime Minister, they're asking for a copy of the resolution.
Yes, he has a copy, but he can't read it anyhow.
That's not nice.
Mr. Speaker, I was asked by the acting leader of opposition business to indicate the list of speakers that will be making presentations today. And I think it is important that we are all advised of this. The order of speaking will be as follows, and I ask each member who will make a presentation to just take note of it. The Prime Minister will open the debate. Next, the leader of the opposition will make his presentation. Next, the Attorney General will speak. Then the opposition spokesman on foreign affairs, the member from Southeast St. Anne, followed by the Minister of Industry, Commerce, Agriculture and Fisheries, who will be followed by the member from Central Manchester, who will be then followed by the Minister of Tourism, and after that, the member from Western St. Andrew, and the member from West Central St. Catherine and Minister of Health, and finally the opposition spokesman on foreign affairs, on housing and Highgate and everything else. And then the debate will be closed by the Prime Minister. Just keep note of that and speak in that sequence. Thank you very much.
Mr. Speaker, I now move for the suspension of standing orders to enable me to take the motion, notice of which I gave earlier.
Those in favor? Those against? As have it. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, there has been much debate in the public domain about CARICOM. Some of the information and the debate in the public domain has not always benefited from a studied view of the issues that surround Jamaica's participation in CARICOM. And speaking, Mr. Speaker, as the Prime Minister of the country, but also leader of a political party, the expressions that have come sometimes would seek to indicate that there is some reluctance on this side to fully participate in CARICOM. By this debate, Mr. Speaker, I wish to put pay to such thought that there is no reluctance on this side to participate in CARICOM. What we have always maintained is that our participation in whatever regional organization must make sense for Jamaica. And we have also maintained that a weak Jamaica does not make a strong CARICOM. And we acknowledge Jamaica's important leadership role in building and strengthening and sustaining the institution of CARICOM. We assembled a team of eminent persons to review Jamaica's participation in CARICOM and advise the government so that we can take a studied approach to the issues of CARICOM. You will recall that in 2016, 2017, there was great concern regarding issues of free movement of persons within the region. You would recall that there was concern in our business community that there are unfair trade practices, particularly to do with the subsidizing of oil. And those, Mr. Speaker, those concerns rose to the level where it prompted me to assemble this very eminent group of Jamaicans to study the issue and advise the government. I want to thank former Prime Minister Bruce Golding, who chaired the committee, which was comprised of then Ambassador Dr. Nigel Clark, Dr. Damian King, Mr. Christopher Levy, Mr. Metrosiaga, Mrs. Michelle Chung, Mr. Warren MacDonald, Mrs. Maxine Henry Wilson, Professor Eleanor Brown, Mr. Michael Diamond, Mr. Dennis Cohen, Mr. John Jackson, Mr. Kevin O'Brien Chang, Mr. William Mafood, Ambassador Lauren McDonough, Mr. Donny Bunting, and Mr. Hugh Johnson. Mr. P.B. Scott eventually replaced Mr. William Mafood, who sat in the capacity as president of the PSOJ. I want to publicly thank them for the work that they have done. And I'm sure the entire House will agree that this is a very well researched, very well put together report. And of course, Mr. Speaker, the Commission consulted very widely, and in fact, consulted many prime ministers across the region and business leaders and other stakeholders. So I have great confidence in the report, and I believe that it is a good tool in directing and helping government to chart a policy towards CARICOM. Mr. Speaker, though we are the government, when it comes to dealing with regional policy, and when you want to ensure that there is sustainability in your policy. It is important that we bring these matters of such national importance to the floor of Parliament to allow for debate. Because, Mr. Speaker, we wouldn't want there to be, God forbid, a change in administration and then there is a change in policy. There was no change in our policy. But it is important that for a policy like this, that there is continuity, that the community itself can look on Jamaica and rely on its position regardless of which administration is in power. So I thought Mr. Speaker and the Leader of the Opposition agreed that we should have this national debate in Parliament. So, Mr. Speaker, I propose to very quickly go through the government's position on the 32 recommendations made in the report. Let me say from the outset that the government has not accepted all the recommendations en bloc. There are some that we can agree with, some that we may have to say, let's consider this for the future, and there may be some that we would have to examine more closely before we say we could implement. And I suspect that that may be the same approach taken by the opposition. Mr. Speaker, we can all agree that the report is timely and that it represents a significant milestone in the ongoing dialogue across the region on whether the integration movement is indeed serving the interests of our nationals and member states. I believe that the work can be regarded as focused and informative, and that it will become an integral part of the historical record available to the people of the region. You would have noted that the report has 33 recommendations which boldly project a way forward in addressing aspects of our regional relationships that are not fully meeting their intended objectives. They also include approaches which could forge strategic partnerships with other CARIFORUM states in the Northern Caribbean to buttress the government's measures to economic growth. Mr. Speaker, our extensive review of the report has identified recommendations at various stages of readiness for implementation, including some that may not be within our reach at this time for various reasons. The recommendations fall into three categories. Those recommendations that present themselves as readily implementable in the short to medium term, utilizing existing resources and capitalizing on the community's ongoing reform process. Other recommendations that are feasible, but which will require significant institutional and legal adjustments, including amendments of the revised Treaty of Chagarams. And yet another set of recommendations, while ought to be pursued, but which are likely to be extraordinary in their requirement for collective political will. Turning first to some of the recommendations that have the greatest potential for implementation in the short to medium term, I will begin with matters of governance, including performance management, financial management, development financing, institutional framework, and relations, economic relations. Performance oversight. Recommendation 17 calls for all institutions and agencies to be subjected to a performance evaluation every 3 years. The report which should be, and the reports, Mr. Speaker, should be made public. This would promote meaningful reordering of activities and emphasize the delivery of results. Jamaica fully supports the recommendation in the context of the government's commitment to the principles of transparency and accountability. Recommendation number 4 further highlights the need for oversight of the functioning of the Secretariat through the establishment of an oversight body comprising eminent persons. In similar vein, Recommendation 21 calls for the implementation of the 2012 Landell Mills Report, which prescribes reorganization and strengthening of the Secretariat and CARICOM institutions. Both recommendations suggest that the solution rests in strong oversight and reporting functions. A stronger, reliably funded CARICOM Secretariat and a Secretary General who has greater executive authority alongside accountability for delivery. The idea of oversight in international and regional organizations is not new. The UN had created the Office of Internal Oversight Services, the OIOS, and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, had established an eminent persons group. The Office of Internal Oversight Services has assisted the UN Secretary General in fulfilling his oversight responsibilities by addressing instances of waste and mismanagement. Through this provision of audit, investigation, inspection, and evaluation services, the office has proven vital to the sustainability and effectiveness of the UN. In like manner, the Eminent Persons Group of ASEAN, which comprises highly distinguished and well-respected citizens from the ASEAN member countries, are meant to examine the group's cooperation activities, undertake thorough reviews of the existing institutional framework, and propose appropriate improvements if so required. However, while the government embraces the spirit of the recommendation, we do recognize that they hinge on the creation of another institution with attendant budgetary implications, and that is inconsistent with the goal of streamlining the operations of the organization. Mr. Speaker, we may want to consider, instead of establishing new institutions for oversight, we could very well have the existing oversight bodies in member countries. Most of our countries would have an Auditor General, for example, to examine the government's commitments to CARICOM and report to the public, which would effectively also be reporting to the CARICOM region on the government's performance. That may be, Mr. Speaker, one way in which we can increase oversight. Perhaps, however, Mr. Speaker, the more feasible option would be to utilize and empower the existing CARICOM Committee of Ambassadors, and there is such a Committee of Ambassadors, which we would probably want to now form as our own group of eminent persons, as a means of providing the oversight needed. I could immediately think, Mr. Speaker, of utilizing the former prime ministers in the region, who would immediately already have good relations. They would know each other. They would probably, some of them have connections to the existing administration, and would have been elevated out of the political realm into the realm of statesmen and women, and could very well use their eminent person status to encourage governments to keep their fulfill their agreements and commitments. Another recommendation, Mr. Speaker, which focuses on institutional governance is recommendation 16, which speaks to the mandatory streamlining of results-based management principles and calls for the submission of annual reports and audited financial statements to heads of government. The recommendation also calls for the publication of the status of member states' contributions. Mr. Speaker, that is now not currently done and would add a new dimension of transparency and indeed oversight to the activities of the various institutions of CARICOM, which, Mr. Speaker, do come at a cost. They are not light on the budget of Jamaica. As regards results-based management, we are pleased to note that the implementation is already underway in the community. And we recall that at the 35th meeting of the Conference of Heads of Government held in Antigua and Barbuda in 2014, approved the community's 5-year strategic plan, which commits the Secretariat to establish a planning, monitoring, and evaluation and reporting system that is based on the principles of results-based management and is in response to the need to target a narrow range of specified outcomes within specified timeframes in relation to the regional development agenda. Mr. Speaker, in terms of issues related to financial management, in keeping with recommendation 12, the government is committed to providing the CARICOM Secretariat with the necessary resources to conduct its work. I am pleased to note that Jamaica has been commended in recent times for keeping pace with our contributions in spite of the harsh economic and financial realities. And I commend the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade for the strenuous efforts it has made in that regard over the last year. We therefore support the Commission's proposal for greater incentives or stricter enforcement of sanctions to promote liquidation of member states' subscription arrears. As the second largest contributor to CARICOM, Jamaica has taken careful note of the scale of assessed contributions for which we are currently obliged to pay 23.15% of the budget of CARICOM. Jamaica has long advocated for the basic principle that each member state of CARICOM should pay its contributions according to its capacity to pay. And as such, we will continue to call for a contributions methodology that better reflects each member state's capacity to pay in an equitable manner based on the most current and comparable data available. In that regard, we fully support recommendation number 12 in relation to sharing financial obligations on an equitable basis, taking account of variables such as levels of indebtedness. We are well aware that good financial management depends not only on the predictability of funding, it relies also on the standards applied to the allocation and disbursement of funds. Undoubtedly, CARICOM must strive to spend more wisely, more responsibly, in accordance with agreed budget levels. In that regard, we welcome the considered proposal of the Commission in recommendation number 7, which would make it mandatory for the Secretary General, in accordance with Article 27(5) of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, to provide technical assessments including cost implementations prior to the taking of decisions by the heads of government. We should no longer be expected to adopt initiatives or strategies without the benefit of the transparency provided by the presentation of a thorough analysis of associated costs. Mr. Speaker, some recommendations focused on financing for development. A crucial matter for Jamaica and all CARICOM member states, given our unique structural characteristics, our unsustainable debt burdens, and high levels of vulnerability to exogenous economic and environmental shocks. In this vein, Recommendation 10 calls for Jamaica's commitment to the second funding cycle of the Caribbean Development Fund. Now, you will recall that CARICOM middle developing countries, the MDCs, or we say more developed countries, including Jamaica, had opted out of benefiting from the country assistance program of the Caribbean Development Fund until the second funding cycle, and that despite our struggles to meet the objectives of our commitment of US 19.69 million under the first funding cycle of the Caribbean Development Fund, we completed payment of our arrears in 2017. I remember this, Mr. Speaker, because in our last term as government, many appeals were made to us to make payments. And even during those difficult times, we still made our attempts. My recollection is that the previous administration also made some attempts to pay. I don't know how much we actually paid. But, Mr. Speaker, in 2017, in May, we completed our obligation to this $19.69 million US to the Caribbean Development Fund. Just to reinforce the point, Mr. Speaker, the agreement within CARICOM was that the MDCs, the middle developing countries or the more developed countries, would not seek to benefit from that cycle of funding. So they would contribute, but they would not seek to benefit. They would not send in project applications. They would allow the lesser developed countries to be fully, to get the full benefit. But then the second cycle, Mr. Speaker, countries would participate. Mr. Speaker, but that would also mean that we would have to contribute. Jamaica opted, Mr. Speaker, not to contribute and not to ask for or apply for any benefits, any loans, any development assistance from the second funding cycle. Mr. Speaker, the recommendation is that we should participate. But at this time, Mr. Speaker, I think we will have to be frank in saying that it would not be beneficial because the funding cycle has already gone several years. We would only have 2 years. And it is quite likely, Mr. Speaker, that we would not be able to benefit with the time remaining on the second funding cycle. So, Mr. Speaker, with this recommendation for us to participate, we do not, at this time, agree. Mr. Speaker, in reviewing the international framework, the Commission conducted an extensive examination of community institutions and agencies, which I understand was no easy feat, given the number of institutions and their locations. Ultimately, the Commission recommended a review and rationalization of these institutions and agencies with a view to reducing cost, eliminating overlaps, and improving service delivery. I recall that in that regard, the heads of government have repeatedly called for such a review and rationalization to ensure that they remain fit for purpose and contribute to the creation of an enabling environment for coordinated management across the regional integration architecture. It is noteworthy that the Commission's report has underscored that imperative. We acknowledge that annual meetings are held between the Secretary General and the heads of CARICOM institutions and associate institutions, and that these meetings are geared towards promoting coordination and complementarity in the services offered. We also acknowledge that rationalization of community institutions is a part of the governance priority of the community's 5-year strategic plan 2015 to 2019. However, in spite of the annual meetings between the Secretary General and institutions and the strategic plan, there are prevailing inefficiencies and overlaps. We believe, therefore, that there is still significant room for CARICOM's operations, for improving CARICOM's operations through a rationalization process and the adoption of approaches aimed at further savings and efficiency. Mr. Speaker, with respect to Recommendation 26, which speaks to foreign policy coordination and consultation, there is already in place comprehensive procedures to facilitate consultation and coordination of foreign policy issues under the ambit of the Council of Foreign and Community Relations, COFCO. A review of these procedures, though beneficial, would never guarantee the complete avoidance of varying positions. Positions recently taken by CARICOM countries on various regional and international issues have been a clear reminder of the fact that foreign policy coordination should not be equated with foreign policy harmonization. It would be difficult to avoid differences in foreign policy positions in a regional forum like CARICOM, as they are demonstrative of the divergence of national sovereign interests. I wish to emphasize that point, Mr. Speaker. When we talk about CARICOM, we speak with a certain sense of, a romantic sense of a group working in harmony, operating as one bloc, as if we had a political union. That is not the case, Mr. Speaker. We do try to coordinate our foreign policy, but it is rare, well, not rare, but it is not always the case that you will have harmony in foreign policy. And I think that this is something that we have to accept as just the nature of the regional architecture that we have, that though in our minds we would like to think of the foreign policy as one cohesive, harmonious outlook, that is not the case. Mr. Speaker, the Commission's report recommends that Jamaica seeks clear, definitive commitment from all member states to a specific time-bound, measurable, and verifiable program of action to fulfill all its obligations and complete other requirements for the CSME to be fully established and operational within the next 5 years. It is worth recalling that heads of government approved an implementation plan in July 2017, 10 years ago, which mandates member states to implement their outstanding actions on the CSM within 4 years. Now, the CSME is the CARICOM Single Market and Economy, and the CSM is the CARICOM single market. Slight distinction that the economy requires the coordination of monetary policy and fiscal policy, whereas the market requires most of the harmonization of trade-related policies and institutions that support the market. That's a slight distinction in the terminologies used. So CSME would have been in 5 years, and CSM would be in 4 years. This time frame is notably less than what the Commission has recommended. The implementation plan, I should note, failed to address the single economy. So within this context, the Commission compels us to take the bold move towards addressing the elephant in the room. The Commission is to be commended for the guidance it has provided with respect to feasible options available to Jamaica and other member states regarding the matter of implementation of the CSME and trade engagements. So having regard to the specific recommendations relating to the CSME, the more readily attainable proposals as supported by Ministry of Finance and the Public Service and other relevant authorities would include the harmonization of laws and regulations governing the registration and operation of businesses, the removal of restrictions on the provision of services, the removal of restrictions on the right of establishment, including ownership of land. You would note, Mr. Speaker, that in some CARICOM member territories, you can't just go there and buy land. So there are specific laws which prohibit non-residents, non-citizens from owning land. And there are other requirements, of course, which make it mandatory that if you're going to open a business, you have to have a local participating with a certain percentage. And, you know, these may very well work for those countries. And indeed, I'm certain that even within our own country, there would be persons who would agree with that thought. But the truth is, Mr. Speaker, our economy and our economic policy, on either side of the political divide, we have never sought to have that kind of limitation placed on our economy. But these are the requirements of some of our countries, which pose a restriction, a possible restriction on countries like Jamaica in doing business within CARICOM. Some of the other things, Mr. Speaker, that we should pursue, and we have had agreement internally, would be the modernization and harmonization of intellectual property legislation and the adoption of conventions relating to the registration and administration of patents, trademarks, etc. Recommendation 1.3 relating to integrated capital markets. We believe that an agreed protocol for cross-border regulatory cooperation is essential to any custom union. In this regard, we support the view that this recommendation is attainable within the next 3 years. However, we are also mindful that many member states are currently at various stages of reform to bring their regulatory landscape in line with institutional standards. Consequently, Mr. Speaker, there may be need to apply some flexibility with respect to the timeline for full implementation by all member states. In this matter, Mr. Speaker, I just want to make a point. The harmonization of legislation throughout the region to deal with the movement of capital and the reporting on taxation issues is happening even outside of the requirement of CARICOM. The truth is that FATCA and the requirements of the OECD and the European Union is driving a process of harmonization. Now, it all depends, Mr. Speaker, on whether or not CARICOM heads would be willing to look at what we are already, I hate to use the term forced to comply with, but what we are already complying with, and seek to get greater alignment for the benefit of CARICOM. And so when we're speaking, Mr. Speaker, about harmonizing, it's happening but not being directed by the region. And I think the region could collectively bring to bear some level of harmony in both taxation policy, capital movement policy that could be beneficial for us. So I just wanted to make that point there. Yes. Mr. Speaker, now let me turn attention to the recommendations relating to the right of establishment set out at recommendations 1.18, as well as the services market referred to in 1.16. We believe that these recommendations are well-founded, as member states participating in the CSME have an obligation to remove restrictions on the right of establishment and the right to provide services across the region. In relation to the right of establishment, all member states are to pass the requisite regulation to facilitate the movement of managerial, technical, and supervisory staff. Jamaica is also assessing its implementation of the regime to ensure that no further restriction exists. Jamaica has enacted the Caribbean Community Establishment Services, Capital and Movement of Community Nationals Act in 2014. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, we would probably be the most advanced country in CARICOM in complying with the free movement of labor and people. From a legal perspective, the Commission's proposal at recommendation 1.2 on the full free movement of persons throughout the community, which is subject only to exclusion for security and public health reasons, is quite feasible and consistent with the ruling of the PBCJ. It will be recalled that the Shanique Myrie case clearly established some benchmarks for what is to be achieved. It will now be a matter for the organs and bodies of CARICOM, in consultation with the respective member states, to decide whether these goals may be attainable within a 5-year time period. Further, it is recommended that in addition to security and public health considerations, which are in keeping with Articles 225 and 226 respectively of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, that a further exception to free movement mentions the grounds of becoming a charge on public funds. This would be consistent with the 2007 conference decision, which was taken into account in the Shanique Myrie case. Just to emphasize that point, so Mr. Speaker, Jamaica's position is that there should be only 3 exceptions to the free movement of persons: health, security, and we agree that there should be some consideration, because there are small countries, that the movement of individuals should not become a burden on the public purse of the country in which they are going. And I think that is a reasonable position, Mr. Speaker. Finally, there is still need for clarity with respect to the applicability of the exceptions, so as not to potentially erode the right to free movement or lead to unnecessary litigation processes, where that right is in fact properly invoked. It is important to note that the burden falls on the member states that invokes the exception. It is equally important to underscore that the right to free movement requires persons seeking to move within the CSME region to enter through properly appointed ports so as not to be removed because of illegal entry. They must also abide by the conditions of entry so as not to be removed for reasons of violation of said terms. The report also proposes the establishment of an agreed framework in relation to the operations of the citizenship by investment programs, which are growing and popular within many member states of CARICOM. This would include appropriate protocols and safeguards regarding the terms, conditions, qualifications, and restrictions on participation in citizenship by investment programs. Just to be clear, Mr. Speaker, so that we understand that many persons would know what these programs are, there are countries that set up a framework in which a foreign national could apply by virtue of apply for citizenship in one of our member state countries by virtue of meeting some minimum threshold of investment. Once that investment is made, then citizenship is automatic. They get a passport and they become entitled to the full benefits of the country. Some members have expressed concerns about the program. There is a fear that persons from countries that are blacklisted or countries in which their citizens are fleeing or listed as terrorists could find their way into the Caribbean, and gaining access to one country would give them access to all countries by virtue of having a CARICOM passport. And it is a concern that has been raised. Countries, to be fair, countries with CIP programs have stressed that they go through rigorous checks. They check with their counterparts in the United States, in the UK, in the European Union, to make sure that persons who are applying for citizenship meet the highest standards and that they are on no watch lists or are in any way blacklisted. However, you know, it just takes one misstep and the entire region could be brought into question. So there has to be an agreed protocol and framework around the citizenship by investment programs. Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to make it clear that there are some persons who have raised with me that Jamaica at some point in time contemplated a citizenship by investment program. I'm not aware of that, Mr. Speaker. What we contemplated, both administrations, was an economic residency program, which would place any foreign national seeking to gain Jamaican citizenship on a pathway by virtue of making a certain threshold of investment, but there is no automatic award of citizenship. So they would have to come to Jamaica, they would have to make their investments, we would have to have an opportunity to assess them, and they would have to go through the process of acquiring citizenship. That, Mr. Speaker, is still under consideration. The government has not put it on a priority list of things to be done, but it is still under consideration. And, Mr. Speaker, once we have a framework agreed within CARICOM about how we treat with these programs, then we would, Mr. Speaker, seek to fast-track our own program of economic residency. It should be noted, Mr. Speaker, that we have taken the time to ensure that the persons who have benefited from CIP programs in other countries, that the systems are in place to ensure that there is no threat to Jamaica from those persons who have benefited.
Prime Minister, could you hold it there? Let me advise the leader of government business that your time for speaking has expired, and you may seek to the House a resolution.
Mr. Speaker, I ask that the Prime Minister be allowed sufficient time to allow him to complete his presentation.
Those in favour? Those against? Ayes have it. Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, members. I promise that I will spare you the sufficient time to finish, because this is indeed an extensive report, and I may not need to go through every single recommendation in detail. So I will update the House on the ones that I consider to be of great importance. Mr. Speaker, let me now address trade agreements, which might be a little bit more challenging to accomplish within 5 years without strong political will. A long-standing controversial issue is the removal of all non-tariff barriers to trade. Now, here is where we really have contention in CARICOM. CARICOM has done considerable work in its efforts to implement a myriad of harmonization protocols and policies to minimize obstacles to trade in this area. These include the establishment of various regulatory mechanisms, namely the Caribbean Agriculture, Health and Food Safety Agency and CARICOM Regional Organization for Standards and Quality. Notwithstanding the existence of these mechanisms as well as the various monitoring frameworks, there are still significant challenges being experienced as manifest in ongoing disputes among member states. Yet another complex issue is the free circulation of goods imported from outside the CSME, once the appropriate import charges have been paid at the original port of entry. This matter is sensitive and has implications for revenue collection by member states, since in such a scenario, the port of final destination would not be the port of entry of the good. The port of destination would therefore must rely on the administrators of the port of entry to collect and remit the applicable duties and charges. Now, Mr. Speaker, just from a practical point of view, if we truly have a common market and a single economy, then it doesn't really matter which port the goods enter, because we're all part of one market and we have a standardized set of duties. But, Mr. Speaker, you can imagine how difficult it would be to coordinate that, because it might be easier for a shipping company to land goods in Jamaica destined for Trinidad, or where logistics, yes. But, Mr. Speaker, because there might be differential practices, it might not be beneficial to do it now. But it would certainly, Mr. Speaker, improve business within the region. But, as I said, these are some of the difficult trade issues that we have to deal with. A further major issue of contention involves the rules of origin criteria. Among the questions still being debated in relation to extra-regional importation of raw materials to make a final product are: 1, will the final product be allowed to benefit from free circulation? And 2, what are the additional measures that will be implemented to ensure the rules of origin criteria are effectively monitored? Mr. Speaker, recommendation 28 urges CARICOM to conduct all future negotiations of trade or economic agreements as far as possible through CARIFORUM. While it is generally agreed that negotiating through CARICOM would offer greater leverage and would facilitate a stronger negotiating position, it would be imperative that CARICOM's relationship with CARIFORUM be realigned if it is to gain any tangible benefits from this option. This could prove to be an extremely complex process. It will be recalled that the CARIFORUM framework, comprising CARICOM plus Cuba and the Dominican Republic, was specifically developed in the context of a trade and development cooperation relationship between the ACP and the EU. In order to apply this functional group arrangement in other spheres, CARICOM's existing trade arrangements with Cuba and the Dominican Republic would necessarily have to be restructured or replaced. Having said this, however, I should indicate that an interesting process is currently emerging whereby CARICOM and the Dominican Republic are examining modalities for concluding a trade agreement with the UK in a post-Brexit scenario to which I referred earlier, drawing on the existing CARIFORUM EU Economic Partnership Agreement provisions. It remains to be seen whether this kind of collaborative process beyond CARICOM could be extended to other future trading arrangements at the regional and multilateral level. With regard to an agreed protocol for sanitary and phytosanitary standards and procedures set out as at recommendation 1.7, CARICOM has already taken steps in that regard. Positive developments include the establishment of the Caribbean Agricultural Health and Food Safety Agency to, among other things, coordinate and organize an effective and efficient regional sanitary and phytosanitary regime, and to also execute on behalf of member states such actions and activities that are more effectively and efficiently executed through a regional mechanism. Mr. Speaker, with respect to the recommendations relating to harmonization of laws and regulations governing the registration and operations of businesses and standards of incorporation requirements, the community is making strides in these areas which will ultimately facilitate a more enabling environment for business to operate in the region. The finalization of the Caribbean Community Companies Right of Establishment Bill remains outstanding and urgently requires timely attention by heads of government. With reference to online company registry, the current approach does not facilitate a single registration system per se, but to provide a mechanism for the public to, among other things, conduct searches contained in the 13 company registries. CARICOM has also established the CARICOM Regional Organization of Standards and Quality to coordinate the development and harmonization of regional standards in keeping with the relevant international code of good practice for standards development. However, in spite of the progress made to date, there is much more work to be done to ensure complementarity of standards and procedures, as well as ensuring equivalent levels of capacity among member states to enforce them. As it relates to services market, based on the CSME Implementation Plan 2017, most member states have enacted the necessary legislation and are to introduce regulations to provide for a national registrar of service providers, a national the prescribed certificate of recognition, and the prescribed procedures for application and issuance of the certificate of recognition. Jamaica has a strong interest in the services regime and would like to see it fully operational as soon as possible. Mr. Speaker, turning to the issue of fair competition and consumer protection. The Fair Trading Commission and the Consumer Affairs Commission are of the view that the recommendations, particularly those relating to fair competition and consumer protection regulations and processes, are achievable within the 5-year period. Already, Jamaica is compliant with its obligation by virtue of our Fair Competition Act of 1993, which was amended in 2001, and the Consumer Protection Act of 2005, as well as the accompanying regulation in each respect. Our regional jurisdiction with competition and consumer protection legislation includes Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, and Guyana. Over the years, the FTC has been actively assisting other member states, particularly members of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, to enact competition and consumer protection legislation. The FTC currently chairs the CSME unit's subcommittee of the reconvened Task Force on Competition, whose objective is to examine the jurisdictional, legal, and financial implications of having national competition authorities established in all member states, together with the required support system. Mr. Speaker, we fully support recommendation 1.19 on public procurement, which calls for the removal of restrictions preventing suppliers of goods and services from qualifying for government contracts in member states. This will contribute to an enhanced scope for micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises to take advantage of procurement opportunities in member states. Thankfully, CARICOM member states have recognized the importance of an effective, transparent, and equitable public procurement regime across the region. In keeping with the commitments outlined in Article 239 of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, a draft protocol on public procurement for the Caribbean community is being finalized by member states. The protocol aims to remove existing restrictions and harmonize public procurement legislation and procedures throughout the CARICOM region. This will help to reinforce the essential elements for the effective operation of the CSME. Mr. Speaker, I want to address in greater depth the issues affecting the designation of status of CARICOM members, including middle-income countries like Jamaica. Among the recommendations posited by the Commission in Recommendation 9 is the elimination of the differentiation between the more developed countries, the MDCs, and the less developed countries, the LDCs in CARICOM, while retaining the provision in the treaty, in the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas for special treatment of disadvantaged countries, regions, and sectors. The merit of the Commission's proposals lays in the fact that there are no stated and clearly defined criteria for the condition of differentiation. Furthermore, it may well be that LDCs are in a better position to make a greater contribution to financing the CARICOM Secretariat and its institutions. Well, if you look at the traditional classification of countries as LDCs and MDCs, and then you look at their per capita ranking, you would see that many of them, in fact, I believe all of them now, rank above Jamaica. So the criteria that was applied, the taxonomy that was applied 30, 40 years ago, definitely needs to be revisited, reviewed, and I think personally abandoned now. So we agree with the recommendation that that should be revised. Mr. Speaker, Recommendation 23 calls for the restructuring of the existing dispute settlement arrangements in the community through the establishment of a central dispute settlement body. This is an attempt to imitate the structure of the WTO dispute settlement understanding. This recommendation, however, has perhaps not accounted for the fact that the WTO does not have a court as part of its dispute settlement system, whereas the CARICOM region has access to the CCJ for the purpose of dispute resolution. Dispute resolution in trade. The establishment of, well, for Jamaica, for other countries, the establishment of a central dispute settlement body would therefore represent a duplication of existing institutions and mandates. Mr. Speaker, an issue of concern to Jamaican business community over an extended period has been the issue of the difference in the cost of energy across the region, based largely on the application of subsidies. With respect to Recommendation 25, we have taken note of the proposal for CARICOM to approach the CCJ for a final determination about whether domestic subsidies provided by a member state relating to the supply of energy constitute a violation of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas. In theory, this could be the subject of a request for an advisory opinion under Article 212. However, there are several caveats. Only the community and parties to a dispute can request an advisory opinion. Also, the subject matter of the request, that is, energy and subsidies, would have to be covered by the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas. It should be noted that this issue has also proven contentious within the European Union context, as the EU is yet to arrive at an outcome satisfactory to all involved parties. Mr. Speaker, let me say on this issue that I invited the Prime Minister of Trinidad to pay us an official visit, and he did so, I believe, in 2017. And we had frank discussions on the issue of energy. He pointed out that their government has made certain moves to take off any subsidy that may have existed on their petroleum. It is still a contentious issue. It is still a contentious issue for Jamaican businesses. But, Mr. Speaker, I wish to say that the energy policy being pursued by Jamaica, including the upgrade of our refinery, moving to greater renewable energy, and converting to LNG, will in fact lessen the impact and dependency on oil, and indeed oil coming from, and petroleum products coming from within the region. But this matter, Mr. Speaker, is still one that is not resolved. In closing, Mr. Speaker, I must reiterate my appreciation to the Chairman of the Commission on his outstanding leadership and work, as well as for the valuable contribution of the other 18 distinguished members of the Commission. We owe them a debt of gratitude for their skill and dedication throughout their robust review of CARICOM's performance against its revised treaty objectives and assessing its benefits to Jamaica, including its contribution to our economic growth. I also want to record my gratitude to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the extensive work that it has undertaken, not only as the Secretariat to the Commission, but also in facilitating various analyses of the findings of the report and the related recommendations. Since tabling the report in February of this year, the entire region has awaited the government's final position on the document. Having explored the recommendations in detail, I think it only appropriate that they be granted the requisite bipartisan consideration, so that they may be duly shared with my CARICOM colleagues for discussion at the upcoming regular meeting of the conference in July. I thank you, and I look forward, I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to the robust contribution to our debate on this critical report. The effectiveness of the regional integration process in CARICOM begs our collective constructive input. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Dr. Peter Phillips.
Mr. Speaker, this debate provides one of the few opportunities really afforded to us all in this House to harmonize our positions regarding an important aspect of our national reality, and that is in relation to our position in CARICOM. I think it's worth remarking that regionalism has been an essential part of our social and political reality, extending throughout the entire period of our modern political life. Indeed, the early strivings for political independence were all conceived of initially as part of a regional framework. And then, while ultimately federation was not to succeed, I think the fact of the matter is that 4 years after independence, in Jamaica, Jamaica saw fit, in fact, during an administration drawn from that side, to participate in the free trade area in the first instance, which then evolved into the Caribbean community, CARICOM, as we now have it, during an administration drawn from this side. And subsequently, there have been successive revisions of the CARICOM Treaty, the Treaty of Chaguaramas, which was revived and which evolved into the proposals for the single market and economy in the early part of this century. Yet for all that, I think in recent times, as has been mentioned, there has been a growing feeling in certain sections of the community, and one might add with good reason, that all was not well with the regional experience. There were a number of concerns which have been mentioned, some of particularly high profile, as in the case of Shanique Myrie, where it was felt that the promise of free movement of CARICOM citizens that was implied by the single market and economy was not being fulfilled. Subsequently, there were numerous reports of Jamaicans being denied entry to Trinidad and Tobago. I think that there were complaints amounting to about 300 who were denied entry, and they felt improperly denied entry to Trinidad and Tobago in 2016. Alongside that, there were the complaints, I think, also of unfair trade practices that were putting Jamaican producers, it was claimed, at a disadvantage. So much so that the president of the PSOJ in 2016 called for a boycott of goods from Trinidad and Tobago. While there was not a boycott, I think the response on the part of the government was indeed, at least in part, the establishment of this commission. Certainly it is in that context that the commission was established to review Jamaica's relations with CARICOM and the CARIC Forum frameworks, and this commission was to be chaired by former Prime Minister, the Honorable Bruce Golding. We join with the Prime Minister on this side in expressing our appreciation to the commission chaired by former Prime Minister Golding and the members of the commission, some of whom are well known to us, who participated in this. Truly, it was not only an extensive and representative national effort, but it also undertook widespread consultations, not only within Jamaica, but across the Caribbean. Now, there is the question of the report itself, and the government has, through the Prime Minister, outlined its position on specific recommendations. I am going to take the position that we are, in effect, debating the report, and less so the government's position on the report. For one thing, we haven't had a time really to reflect on the government's position as outlined. But for another, I think we probably differ on how we would want to approach the report. It's not a matter that should cause great contentiousness. But I believe that essentially the report contains a series of recommendations, some of which have found favor, some of which have not. But there is still a question which arises, even if you select some recommendations and exclude some. The question, nevertheless, does remain, what is the core, the essential core set of recommendations which, if implemented, will fundamentally transform the experience of CARICOM and make it a more efficient and representative institution capable of advancing the interests of the Caribbean peoples and of Jamaica in particular. And quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, I don't think that given what is either presented in the report or what is presented by the Prime Minister is sufficient to enable us to define the essential critical minimum which will enable us to achieve our objectives of fundamentally transforming the efficiency of CARICOM and transforming the CARICOM experience by Caribbean peoples. To that extent, I think that what we will obviously need is further analysis of this report. I think it represents an important and good starting point. Indeed, what I would propose is that it becomes the template, in effect, that we should ask the heads of government of CARICOM to utilize as they collectively embrace the need to move forward to implement the single market and economy and to review other aspects of the CARICOM experience. The truth is that the report, the Golding Report, concentrates its focus, at least in its executive summary and in the summary of recommendations, primarily on the CSME and the need to implement the single market and the economies. But not all the recommendations in that section are of the same moment. Not all of them are of the same significance. And I'd like to highlight some of those that I believe warrant more careful consideration, and which I believe, however, at the same time are absolutely critical if we are to fundamentally transform CARICOM. The central analysis provided is that by the Golding Report, Golding Commission, is that there is an implementation deficit in CARICOM. And I don't think there's anybody who has experienced CARICOM over the many, many decades of its existence could quarrel with that assessment of it. I think anyone who has had any ministerial association with it, drawn from both sides, could agree that there has been this implementation deficit. Now, there are some factors which have been around as explanatory factors, some of the explanations as to why this implementation deficit have been around with us from some time, from the Ramphal report in the 90s, and indeed some even before that, concerning the whole question, for example, of the unanimity rule in CARICOM, because it has become a block to the implementation of any far-reaching recommendation. Now, I think we can all accept that it would be a very difficult rule to change. Nevertheless, the difficulty of changing it does not minimize the necessity, in my view, of at least making an attempt to secure some changes. And in the report, there is an approach which I would commend for consideration, that maybe at least it is possible to separate out some range of decisions and activities which may not be subject to the unanimity rule, or where a qualified application of the rule may be warranted. Equally, the question contained in recommendation 5 is weighty, but again, difficult necessities are necessities just the same. The fact is that unless there are, in fact, penalties that are applied, some sanctions for non-performance in relation to the decisions taken at the highest level of CARICOM, heads of government, and by the other organs, then we are going to have a repetition of the pattern whereby people come, say aye, and then go away and forget about the commitments given. And, you know, Einstein is said to have defined madness as doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. To continue to pass resolutions year after year at sessional and intersessional meetings and then make no further contribution to the performance, whether financial or in human resource terms, or otherwise, to implement those decisions, then we'll continue in that way. So it would seem to me that recommendation 5 in the summary of recommendations, which suggests A, that we should make explicit provision in the CARICOM Treaty requiring member states to give effect to the rights and obligations within their states arising from community law, as well as decisions of the heads of government that require executive action within a time frame to be specified, is worthy of support, specifically. And that further, there should be established in the treaty a body of sanctions for willful non-compliance or flagrant breaches of those obligations. It sets out some of those possible sanctions, including the right to vote on particular decisions of the conference, the loss of entitlement to benefits from the institutions, restricted access to policy-based loans from the Caribbean Development Bank, widening provision for member states to be authorized to take retaliatory action against another member state. And there may be others, including monetary fines that can be imposed on states who willfully ignore the decisions of heads of government. I think that there is also particular relevance to the recommendation, which has been mentioned by the Prime Minister at number 9, which simply put is to state that the distinction that was assumed decades ago between so-called MDCs, more developed countries, and less developed countries is now obsolete, and that you have a situation where countries which are in per capita terms, like Jamaica, are carrying a higher share of the budget, and there are other countries that quite frankly willfully ignore their budgetary contributions. We have to recognize that from time to time there are states which are affected by climate-related crises. There are states which may have particular development challenges relating to high levels of debt or otherwise that need to be taken into account. Without going into too much detail, I think there is also need for a much more thoroughgoing review of the functional cooperation institutions. There's scope, there's a lot of duplication of effort. There are lots of inefficiencies, and I don't think any of the institutions, including the universities, ought to be excluded from this assessment as to the utilization of the scarce resources made available to them and whether they are being optimally used. We don't need to assume that that we have to continue doing things in the way that we have been doing them, and the amount of money spent simply traveling from country to country for the series of meetings, harmonizing. No, those don't take place. We certainly need to see whether we are getting benefit for the scarce resources being spent by CARICOM governments. Certainly, I believe that we need to place particular emphasis, and here I agree with the thrust of the Commission report, on the implementation of all the CSME provisions, including the free movement of people with the reservations in relation to security, public health that are outlined. I think we certainly would await to see what the government is proposing in relation to citizenship by investment. Suffice it to say that in the countries in the region where that is practiced, it's essentially a payment for a passport. And that is something we would not, on this side, find favor with. And I think we have to recognize, even as we go through tough times, we need to nevertheless reaffirm what is our view, that perhaps the most treasured thing all of us can have is citizenship of Jamaica, and it's not to be traded, given out lightly, or otherwise become a commodity for purchase on the market. It is something which has been earned by the sweat, blood, tears of many generations. But at the same time, even as we say that, let us remind ourselves that we need to continue to give it meaning, and most of all, by enforcing standards of good governance and the operations of modern state concepts in our country. Now, with this report, the question arises, what is to be done with this report? The authors suggest, and I want to quote, that a specific time-bound, measurable, and verifiable program of action, end quote, for states to fulfill and complete all their obligations for the CSME to be fully established and operational within 5 years, failing which they recommend that Jamaica should withdraw from the trade and the economic elements of CARICOM. Mr. Speaker, I think this, while the resolution presented by the Prime Minister adjusts that statement somewhat, I think we need to examine the foundations of such an approach more closely. It may be that it is the intention of the members of the Commission in stating this 5-year absolute deadline, intended as a negotiating ploy, as an opening gambit, so to speak. Presumably the intention here is to signal the seriousness with which Jamaica views the CARICOM situation and our determination to ensure that real action is taken. We certainly share the view, Mr. Speaker, that the time for Sosa chat has come to an end as far as this CARICOM matter is concerned, and we believe that we can't talk this problem around and kick it around any longer. At the same time, I don't think that proceeding on the basis of threat is a viable approach and ought not to be pursued. This is not to say that tough negotiations won't be necessary. I think they will be. But I also believe that Jamaica has more than enough leverage to be able to enforce its position, represent its views firmly, courageously, with determination in our negotiations with our CARICOM partners. We are the single largest market in CARICOM, and quite frankly, I don't think we have always used this leverage sufficiently. But you don't begin with a threat. A threat comes at the end of good faith negotiations. In fact, a threat really isn't to be used. That you need to just implement, do what you're going to do. Moreover, I think there's no magic to the 5 years, and we need to be realistic. In fact, when I look at the report, I see that the report has been with the government for more than a year. So at least from the point of view of the commission itself, 1 year of the 5, 20% of the time has elapsed, and nothing has been forthcoming from the government till now. Not to mention that we were promised when it was brought to the House that the Internal and External Affairs Committee of the House would be given a chance to consider the report. But then there was the committee has not been reappointed for reasons to do with political maneuver, I suspect. No, not you, him. It's not fair. Anyway, all right. If it's not fair, I withdraw it. We are still to determine why it has not been appointed. It's a work in progress. All right. But I make the point simply that governmental decisions are often cumbersome. And what do the lawyers say? He who seeks equity must come with clean hands. Who are the lawyers around here? No, I'm appealing to lawyer Reverend Thwaites, who administers not only the law of man, but ecclesiastical law as well. He who seeks equity must come with clean hands. And so if we are ourselves cumbersome, I could appeal to the Honorable Minister of Foreign Affairs, except that she's not in the chamber. But she nods affirmatively. The fact is that we have to recognize that intergovernmental operations are often cumbersome. Operations even within a single governmental apparatus are often cumbersome. So simply to set a deadline unilaterally is not likely to evoke the kind of compliance and buy-in that ultimately is what we want from our CARICOM partners. It ought not to be our intention to throw it down on a take it or leave it basis. My way or the highway, as someone once said.
Members, time for speaking has expired. House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I ask that the member be permitted enough time to complete his presentation.
Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it. Mr. Phillips.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm much obliged to my colleagues in the House for their indulgence. I think what we need to be doing, as I said, is to be able to inspire our CARICOM colleagues to take this report as an indication of our own seriousness of purpose, as an indication of our commitment to the institution and the process, but to involve them in the process as well. Secondly, I think we need to face the fact that to threaten to leave CARICOM, the trade and financial aspects, would be like cutting off our nose to spite our face. Because the report itself makes mention of the fact that globalization has fundamentally transformed the reality of our existence in the international economy, and in fact has made our several states in the Caribbean more vulnerable. The Prime Minister himself made mention to the fact that as a region, we comprise highly indebted states, and despite the reduction in our own debt to GDP ratios, we still remain among the most highly indebted globally and among the most highly indebted in the region. But beyond that, we are seeing now a world facing particularly intense turbulence in relation to the architecture of the international economy and the international political system. the implications of Brexit, for example, are still unclear. They will indeed, if it succeeds, which we don't know what will happen, but it will require a renegotiation of our access to UK markets. The looming trade war between the United States and China and others, and Canada, Mexico, the EU, creates a further element of uncertainty in the world economy. Energy markets are being affected. Oil and gas supplies are not only of uncertain price, but uncertain supply. In this environment, Mr. Speaker, CARICOM becomes even more important to our future. We need to make it work, not threaten to leave. Specifically, we propose that the Golding Report become the template to provide fundamental direction to a review of the CARICOM institutional mechanisms to be undertaken by a CARICOM review committee, suitably appointed. We support specific timelines being established, not only for the preparation of this report, but for the implementation of specific elements to be identified. Now that Jamaica is entering into the chairmanship of CARICOM, we think that armed with this report, having it in hand, it gives Jamaica, with the support of the entire Parliament, an opportunity to exercise decisive influence on the outcome of such a process. It will require exemplary leadership. It will require skill, determination, commitment, and it will require sincerity of purpose. And I think in that regard, I would want to urge the government to consider and reconsider its foreign policy approaches in light of its assumption of this leadership role in CARICOM. If you are to lead or inspire a team or an organization, you must subscribe to the principles of the organization, and you must be the paramount defender of the interests of that organization. CARICOM is essentially an aggregation of small states. And small states have particular interests that distinguish them from large states. Small states are particularly reliant on the prevalence of the rule of international law, because that's all we can rely on. We have no armies, we have no great navies, no force of arms, no ability to exercise economic leverage. All we can rely on is the rule of international law, which says that might does not make right. And we must depend on the United Nations system, which is the embodiment and I dare say the defender of these international legal principles. So a vote on the status of Jerusalem, Mr. Speaker, is not simply a matter of other states can decide where they want to put their embassy, not when the United Nations, by virtue of its Security Council resolutions, has said unanimously that this is a matter to be reserved for the settlement of the larger Israel-Palestine question. We cannot undercut. Equally and closer to home, I think the time has come. If we are urging a more substantial role for the CCJ in its original jurisdiction, if we want to lead the elaboration of this network of CARICOM institutions, ought we not collectively to show leadership as far as completing the establishment of the CCJ, or at least Jamaica's accession in its appellate jurisdiction? Mr. Speaker, we think that this report, as we have said, represents a serious effort, but it is a beginning, it's not the end. Much more work needs to be done. We have to make the transition now from it being a Jamaican report, so to speak, to it providing the signposts, the guidelines, the guiding light, if you will, for breathing new life and energy into CARICOM. We all want that. I think I can say with no risk of successful contradiction that we on this side are regionalists. We claim our identity proudly as Jamaicans, but we also claim it as Caribbean people fixed in this region. We will sink or swim, our destinies are intertwined with the destinies of other people in this Caribbean region, bounded by this Caribbean Sea. We contemplate an expansion, as is contemplated by the report, of CARICOM. We contemplate also other associations. We were avid supporters and are of the Association of Caribbean States. We know that our closest neighbors in the Caribbean are Cuba, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and we have historic linkages with the countries in Central America. We have more people talking, perhaps the largest single population which talks Jamaican outside of Jamaica, and outside of North America is in Panama and Costa Rica. And I mean talking Jamaican. Yes. And Colombia too. Yes. Just as an aside, I once encountered a gentleman in Panama. No, in Panama City. And he said to me, when last I go to St. Elizabeth? So I said, this man must have been there recently. He sounded very Jamaican thing. So I said, when last you went home? He said, I have never been to Jamaica, but he sounded like he was from Junction, Mr. Speaker. Eh? Like how that gentleman sounded. But, Mr. Speaker, we don't expect nor do we pursue political union. but we are unapologetic about the fact that we are stronger together when we combine our energies with our brothers and sisters in the Caribbean. And it is a collective challenge that history has now bequeathed to us, that we in our time breathe new life into the CARICOM institutions and the CARICOM experience. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mrs. Malahoo Fort.
May it please you, Mr. Speaker. See if we can take this back. Mr. Speaker,
she's not distracted.
I rise to make my contribution to this motion. And I begin by saying that I stand in a moment of anticipation and expectation that the work of the Commission will propel action in an unprecedented manner. Starting first with this Parliament and with the government of Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, I am a proud Caribbean national. And, you know, being regionalist is not limited to that side of the House. Mr. Speaker, as you are aware, in February of this year, the report of the Commission to review Jamaica's relations with the Caribbean Community and CARIFORUM frameworks was tabled in this Honourable House. The Commission was mandated to review the effects of Jamaica's participation in CARICOM and analyze whether CARICOM has met the goals and objectives of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas. And I think the Leader of the Opposition indicated that there was an undue focus on the CSME, but I think it is because of that mandate why the focus rightly is there, because it was dealing with the objectives of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas. As the Prime Minister pointed out, the report presents 33 recommendations which have been carefully considered by Cabinet. Mr. Speaker, it may be helpful to further contextualize this debate by reminding ourselves of the governance framework of CARICOM. And it has been highlighted in the report where it points out that CARICOM was established as a community of sovereign states designed to operate on the principle of intergovernmentalism, with each member state retaining all its sovereign authority. And regional policies and decisions were arrived at only by unanimity. This differs sharply from the European Union, which operates under the principle of supranationality, in which member states cede some sovereignty in clearly defined areas to a regional authority. As the report points out, thus, in the EU, there is a Council of the European Union, one representative from each member state, and the European Parliament, directly elected by the voters in each member state. Together, these bodies exercise authority in specified areas that bind member states. It is recognized by and enforceable in the courts of each member state, and where questions of interpretation arise, those are finally determined by the European Court of Justice. In contrast, Mr. Speaker, CARICOM leaders, it is said, are jealous of their sovereign authority, and while they will cooperate and reach agreements at heads of government meetings, they are and ensure that everyone is mindful of the fact that no part of their authority is left at the regional table, but returns home with them on conclusion of their deliberation. I think, Mr. Speaker, it is important to understand this context of CARICOM's governance framework in order for us to ask and meaningfully answer what can realistically be done within this framework. Mr. Speaker, the executive summary of the report points out that the people of CARICOM are confounded by the fact that their adventure into this consortium does not, in many respects, appear to correspond with the demonstrable success or improvement in the quality of their lives. CARICOM's share of world trade has fallen, growth in its output has been anemic, and too many of its people remain poor, jobless, and hopeless. Jamaica is more than a microcosm of that underachievement. Many of us are inclined to blame it on our failed marriage because we were led to believe that integration would have been good for us and would have created opportunities and provided benefits that we would not otherwise have been able to secure. But something, as the executive summary clearly states, cannot be said to have failed unless it has been tried. The single market and economy that we so often declare as not working cannot, in reality, be expected to work because it has not yet been functionally established. The decision we made to bind one, however sincere that intention was, has not up to now been carried through. So much time has elapsed, and so much that should have been done has not been done, that we are in danger of succumbing to integration fatigue without having actually integrated, and we're having difficulty sustaining or renewing our commitment to the process. The situation calls for a firm but calibrated response. Some of the difficulties lie in the architecture itself, an organization that has rules but no effective means of enforcing them, a body that has become unwieldy and costly, an arrangement in which authority and responsibility are not aligned for accountability, and failure is immune to embarrassment. Mr. Speaker, it is therefore understandable why the recommendations are all summed up in the one which calls on Jamaica to seek a clear, definitive commitment by all member states to a specific, time-bound, measurable, and verifiable program of action to fulfill their obligations and complete all requirements for the CSME to be fully established and operational within the next 5 years. Mr. Speaker, in its report, the Commission identifies an implementation deficit, which has already been mentioned, and it notes the need for increased compliance with the obligations under the revised Treaty of Chagaramas and the decisions of organs of CARICOM, such as the Council on Trade and Economic Development, the quoted. In light of this, Mr. Speaker, I should like to focus my contribution on how the bodies responsible for advising and adjudicating on the legal aspects of the revised treaty act as a driving force towards effective implementation of and compliance of the treaty, but are impeded in their role. Mr. Speaker, the Legal Affairs Committee of the Caribbean Community, which I presently chair, consists of ministers responsible for legal affairs or attorneys general of the CARICOM member states, and is responsible for providing the organs and bodies of the Caribbean community with advice on treaties, international legal issues, the harmonization of laws of the community, and other legal matters. While it is not a dispute settlement body, the Legal Affairs Committee plays an important role in facilitating compliance and maintaining the rule of law within the community by advising on whether actions or proposed actions by member states and the community are compatible with the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas. Mr. Speaker, it is important in this debate that we pay close attention to some of the findings of the report and mustn't get too impatient when we look at what the report actually speaks to, because unless we digest it, we will not be able to take the kind of meaningful action that we should take. Mr. Speaker, in respect of the CSME prerequisites, which essentially has been one of the main reasons why the shortcomings of the community relations remain so vexed. A single market and economy, as the report points out. In other words, a single virtually seamless economic space requires a sophisticated infrastructure to singularize 12 separate spaces, politically independent of each other and separated at their extremities by over 2,000 nautical miles from the Yucatan Peninsula, Belize, to the northern coast of Brazil, where we have Guyana and Suriname. Without that infrastructure, the dream